Good afternoon and welcome, and hope you're enjoying the 2020 Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. My name is Matt Kilby. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next panel, Defending the Pass, brought to you by ESPN. Today, our panelists are Kevin Mears, former Director of Research at the Cleveland Browns, Evan Kaplan, Research Specialist, ESPN, Brian Burke, Senior Analytics Specialist, ESPN, Dominique Foxworth, former player, senior writer at The Undefeated. The panel will be moderated by Brian McDonald, Director of Sports Analytics, ESPN.
Coward.
Dominique is also the king of awesomeness. The panel today will be 45 minutes long, followed by 10 minutes of Q&A. If you have a question, please use Twitter with the hashtag #DefendingThePass. And with that, I'll pass it off to Brian. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And thank you all for coming and joining us for this discussion. And I for one, am very honored to be sharing the stage with such royalty here, the king of awesomeness. So that was the official title that he gave us to pass along to the Sloan Conference organizers. King of awesomeness, writer for The Undefeated.
Facts are facts.
So today we're going to be talking about how player tracking data can be used as far as analyzing how players perform at defending the pass. And this is something that was very difficult to do prior to player tracking data becoming available. You can get certain things from play-by-play data in football, but you can't, it's only for a couple players. Maybe you get information about a couple of players, and it's usually offensive players. And, without all 22 video, even if you wanted to manually track your own and collect your own data, it would be difficult without the all 22 data, especially for anything involving defensive backs, because a lot of times they're not even showing on the broadcast feeds. So player tracking data, though, has opened up the door, it's sort of allowed for countless new questions to be asked and possibly answered using data. So that's what we're going to focus on here in this panel, and most of the time will be spent talking about something that sort of hasn't been done, which is coming up with a metric for defensive backs, and we'll have some interactivity with the audience. But first thing we wanted to do was start with some of the things that we have done at ESPN, and just to give an example of what does it look like, what does the end result look like, and we'll talk about the process by which we kind of came up with those metrics. So we have a couple examples here. We have a short 2-minute video that sort of displays some of the work that we've done. So if we could.
This is an all-out blitz. It's a zero blitz. The reason that he's able to hold it for 3.9 seconds is because he makes the defender miss.
Look, he has been doubled on every pass rush tonight.
I doubled him every play, not just every pass rush.
He's the only player in the NFL who's been double-teamed over 500 times since the start of last season.
One moment, please. We're experiencing technical difficulties. We'll restore to the video as soon as we've got it.
I feel like it's my responsibility to be awesome right now in this moment because nothing's happening. I'm sure the video was fantastic. I haven't seen it. I think the mics are working again.
Yeah. So why don't we move on a little bit and come back to that? And we'll see those examples in a second. But one of the nice things about sort of what we've been able to do at ESPN, and by we I mean mostly other people. I've only been there 8 months. But we, the royal we, I guess. One of the nice things is that sort of Brian and Dominique working together. So. It's sort of like the perfect situation where Brian is an analytics expert and has very good knowledge of the game. Dominique is someone who is an expert of the game and has a lot of quantitative knowledge. He's quantitatively savvy and can understand things from that perspective. And they've been able to work together on developing some of these metrics. So just wanted to talk a little bit about, if you could, Sort of how did that collaboration start? And what kinds of things did you guys talk about? And what did each of you learn from those conversations?
I'll start. Well, with player tracking data, you need more and more kind of X and O, like inside the game knowledge, subject matter expertise, domain knowledge. So when we were doing things like sort of in-game decision analysis and those sorts of big picture analytics for the sport of football, you didn't really need to know the difference between a Tampa 2 and a cover 2. But once you get down to player tracking data, basically what you're trying to do is teach a computer to watch film in a smart way. That's really what you're trying to do. And in order to watch film smartly, you really have to understand the game at a much, much deeper level, a level I certainly didn't have before, and I'm still struggling to get there. So the marriage of the analytics and subject matter expertise is critical in exploiting player tracking data. And I think it's just fortunate that I work outside of DC, and Dominique is headquartered in our DC office and studios. So we would bump into each other frequently, and I would just grab onto him for every little drop of information I could squeeze out of him. And he's been awesome. He's been very patient with me and taught me a lot.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I think you were kind of confused by how much I wanted to talk about those things, but it's ideas that because I think that football players in general and anyone who has an area of expertise, when someone from the outside comes in with a different level of expertise and even if they don't purport themselves as being able to help you necessarily, they come in with the idea that they're going to help. And the assumption, I think, for most people is to kind of be like, well, you're new to this, you don't understand it. But I had the good fortune of having my experience outside of football and recognize that there are a lot of smart people and a lot of smart practices that are outside of the sport that can be applied to the sport. So when I was thinking about these things before I joined ESPN, I had delusions that some of these things were possible, and then I met Brian. I was like, oh, he's already way ahead of where I wanted to take the film study and being able to take it to the next step. And he's obviously going to be very humble and say that he's still trying to figure those things out. But I do remember one of the things that was most enticing about working with you was when I was trying to explain to you the simple stuff, like you understood that because you had put in the time to understand the base level, and we could have a conversation. And I could use some of the language that you're comfortable with. You could use language that I was comfortable with. And I think it really helped us to move forward quite quickly. And it's helped me, honestly, with saving time and preparing for TV shows, preparing for writing something, is you can use that data so much more quickly. Because right now what the data does, or what the machine learning software that you use, it does a lot of, the example you used was watching film. It does the things that I did when I was a player. It just does it a lot faster and more efficiently. And it's been super helpful.
Brian, we do have that clip available for you now.
Okay, let's see it.
This is a all-out blitz. It's a zero blitz. The reason that he's able to hold it for 3.9 seconds is because he makes the defender miss.
Look, he has been doubled on every pass rush tonight.
I doubled him every play, not just every pass rush.
He's the only player in the NFL who's been double-teamed over 500 times since the start of last season.
Just look at this heat map and how skewed it is to the right-hand side. And Adams had virtually no success when over there. He caught 2 quick passes on 3 targets. But by and large, when he started on the right, Rodgers looked elsewhere. There's a lot of red there, which isn't what you want to see if you're the Packers.
And he had just a 17.6% chance of making that, according to Next Gen Stats.
Tannehill's expected completion percentage is only 63%, and his plus 10% completion percentage above expected.
That's Michael Thomas. When you consider the fact that this guy has caught 84% of his targets so far this year, which is 15% above expectation. That's #1 in the NFL. That's just ridiculous. Bradley Roby at the top of your screen is sitting outside waiting for this out route. He's waiting for it. That's why the catch probability on this route is 40%.
No quarterback, threw more touchdowns against zone coverage than Patrick Mahomes, and no quarterback had a higher raw QBR. Not only that, but Mahomes was top 10 in pass yards, yards per attempt, and completion percentage as well.
The reality is, if they're going to play that zone, he's the best guy moving people with his eyes.
Yeah.
And you have the best coach in the NFL of taking all 3, 4 guys of their offense and flooding that zone to make defenders wrong.
In 2.2 seconds, his chips are past his. That's the measurement right there, and that's how they get under 2.5 seconds, the average time to pass the ball for a quarterback in the NFL.
We want to take you a little bit deeper on this. According to our pass rush metrics powered by NFL Next Gen, Mac has the 3rd highest win rate in the NFL.
No one drops dimes better than Russell Wilson.
He just puts the perfect amount of air on the football. He just knows how to get it to him in the right trajectory for however many yards his receiver is. He's mastered that.
When we look at our pass rushing numbers, what Watt was doing is he was getting double teamed at a huge rate. So look at the chart here. On the horizontal axis, we're looking at the double team rate for edge defenders, and then the vertical axis is their pass rush win rate, the rate at which they beat their defender within 2.5 seconds. Watt was getting double teamed.
All right.
Appreciated the Browns touchdown getting in there.
So speaking of the Browns, smooth transition to asking you a question. So when you were with the Browns, I mean, what kinds of collaboration sort of went on inside there in the front office? Was it similar to kind of what you just heard with Brian and Dominique, or how was it similar and different?
Sure. I'd say that what Brian and Dominique are describing is basically the goal, and that it was incumbent on everyone in the front office to kind of make that happen. And I'd say we had that with varying success. There were some people who were incredibly generous with their time and their energy and teaching me a lot about the game. A lot of scouts that let me bug them with questions all the time and let me sit in their rooms while they were breaking down film and ask them what they were seeing so that I could try to kind of up my football IQ. But then there were also people who were not as interested in answering my questions, which is perfectly reasonable. But the goal is to build a partnership so that, your own football IQ is high enough that you can do this work on your own because you can't be bothering someone else all the time. They have their own job. But then when you do need their next level of expertise, you have someone that you can go to talk through a really complex problem that you need to work through.
Yeah, and Evan, you have collaborated with Brian and other folks at ESPN, just in the area of this next-gen stats data. Can you just talk a little bit about those collaborations?
Sure. It's really a 3-step process from my perspective. So at the start, it's getting with Brian and the rest of his team, giving them feedback as they're coming up with all these metrics. Recently did that when Brian developed his route tree classification this past season, just talking about how we best define and label those terms so that our fans can understand them. And then after I'm understanding and figuring out the best stories to tell with that data, it's going back and diving into the storylines that are going on around the league, whether it's that week's games or some other storyline. And then finally, the third step, which is really the most important, is I'm having one-on-one meetings with our analysts on Sunday NFL Countdown, Monday Night Countdown, Steve Young, Randy Moss, Rex Ryan, Matt Hasselbeck, etc. And we're taking the data that we have on our end and marrying it with what they're observing and the film breakdown that they see, and we're seeing where there's a match. And that's really the best part where everything kind of comes together. One specific example was before the Chiefs-Lions game this past season, Teddy Bruschi wanted to do a breakdown looking at the Lions defense, which head coach Matt Patricia came from the Patriots system, and look back at the 2018 AFC Championship game where he thought that the Patriots probably played man on a majority of snaps against Mahomes and were able to slow him down in the first half. Now, in the past, he certainly could have generally made that point, but thanks to what Brian does with his team and the fact that we had our pass coverage metrics, we were able to tell that the Patriots, in fact, played man defense on 100% of Mahomes' dropbacks in the first half of that game. That was the only team to play man on 100% of dropbacks in the first half all season. Teddy's able to come up with a breakdown tape. We're able to add that added context that is really just making our fans a lot smarter.
That's, for me at least, that was the best part of that reel, and that speaks to the job that you do. Is it's almost indistinguishable that the stuff is in there unless you're watching for it.
Exactly.
Like the coverage doesn't seem any different. It just happens to be a lot smarter, and no one really knows why. And that's what I think is difficult for me as someone who understands the game, but is also super into this stuff, like I'll find little morsels of stats or something that I think is interesting, and I'll just want to go on TV or just write that particular stat, and like understanding that no one else really cares about the stat. They want to know the story. Like they want to know why this receiver is not making any plays, or why this team struggled on third down. And I can use one of the really interesting things that we found, or I like to look up, is on the spreadsheets is like crossing motion, someone who runs with motion with whether the defense is in zone or not, because normally that's an indicator of man-to-man. And I noticed in the last couple of years, a lot more often than I'd ever seen, we didn't even coach that when I was playing, that people would motion across. There was one play for the Colts in the playoffs a couple years ago where Darius Leonard, the inside linebacker, motioned with a running back to outside and ended up playing deep third as a corner on outside, which led to an interception underneath, which is fascinating to me, but I just put all you guys to sleep because it's just like a bunch of like gibberish. But understanding how to take that and then turn that into a little morsel on TV that is bite-sized, and it just saves so much time and it's so impressive. I know how difficult that is, so when I see that, I think about how valuable you are to those guys and wonder why you never call me.
I think the fans are smarter now, too. So they can appreciate analysis like that maybe 10, 20 years ago, would.
It's nice that the fans are smarter, but it's also like frustrating sometimes because not everyone who covers the game is as smart as you would like them to be. I have many group texts with my analysts and player friends where, especially with my former cornerbacks, everybody on TV always wants to blame the corners, and they never know any better. I need that everyone on TV needs to understand cover two. Just simple. It's a simple coverage. Understand cover two. Guy catches a go on cover two. It's not the corner's fault. That's all. I'm sorry. I'll get off my soapbox.
Good to know. Good to know. Good for everyone here to know, too.
Write it down.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I think sort of the process that you guys just described is something like what Dean Oliver has said in the past, one of the guiding principles of sports analytics, which is words into numbers into words. And we were talking before, I kind of, as a former professor, the thing that came to mind for me was it's like you basically just described the data science process, the entire process, formulating a question, getting data, building some models, getting some results, and then figuring out how to communicate those results to the audience, and how basically all of those steps involve some sort of collaboration and some sort of iteration. So that's exactly the kind of thing. It's exactly the kind of model that you would try to teach students about the data science process. But so let's move on here to our next topic. And if you may have noticed in the clips that we showed earlier that there was nothing about individual pass performance as far as defensive backs and defending the pass. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. And so we're kind of going to pretend that we were asked by a GM or someone at ESPN or maybe our boss, Jeff Bennett, hey, we need a way to quantify pass coverage for individuals. We need a way to determine how defensive backs are contributing to their team's performance in terms of defending the pass. And how do we do that? So let's break it down a little bit. We're going to start with just press coverage, and we're going to start by showing a few clips here. And Dominique, and there's going to be some clips of Richard Sherman in press coverage, and Dominique's going to talk through some of the things that Sherman does well on the plays, what he doesn't do well, and then we'll bring it back to the panel here.
All right. That's Sherman up top right there. And I think when you're in press coverage, the most important thing, he keeps his leverage on that spot, and that's why he makes that play there. But keep your leverage is important, but you want to win at the line. If you get up close and you lose, you're in trouble right off the bat. And again, he doesn't necessarily win at the line necessarily, but he understands where his help is, and he, based on the split of that receiver, keeps himself in good position. The same play. And this is it with the dots. I love the dots. But understanding that you can narrow down what plays you're going to get. And I think the data helps us to do that based on splits, down and distance, and all that stuff. I think Richard Sherman, I mean, it's kind of a cliche at this point because people say it so much about him. He's one of the smartest players. And I've seen him be able to eliminate routes, and I see him thinking through the process. And lots of players are able to do this. They think through the process of the play, and you can see once they eliminate routes. You see it on, I don't know how many more clips we have of Richard, but I know some of the other clips right here. And this is a good win. I think he gives up the pass here. It happens, but it's a good win. You see how long he keeps him at the line of scrimmage. He forces him to redirect. He buys time, and you can't win them all, as they say. They get paid too. When I was in school, you say they're on scholarship too, but sometimes you lose again. You lose one or two. Richard loses this one, but it's through no fault of his own necessarily. He keeps his leverage. He buys time. He forces him to redirect twice in the route, right there and then right there again. Can we go into the next one? And this one, that's a fade. That's a tough one. He does a good job of getting his hands on him. Richard is not the fastest guy ever, so that's a tough spot to be in. The ball doesn't come his direction, but he's in good position. In this spot, you want to get him off the line. You want to get him as close to the sideline as possible. That's something that he does well in that situation. All right, to the next one. Okay, this is incredible. I don't know what he knew about this play, but this is what I talk about when you say you can eliminate routes. I'm not sure why, if it was in film study, but you can see once he gets a hand on him at the front and the guy gets past him a little bit, I would panic. Any normal corner in that situation would probably panic and start running deep. But there's something about this that Richard's eyes are in the backfield. He kind of doesn't even care if he goes deep. I think he knows because of maybe the inside release. That was probably it, because most of the time the deep routes, they like to do outside release. Something about the film study in this week allowed him to be more aggressive at the line. And then you see right there, there's no panic. He's just waiting. All right, next one. Yeah, that's called losing at the line. I mean, it happens to everybody. When you're going to be up there and you have a speedy guy like that, you're not going to win them all. He gets back in position. And I think one of the good things about having the reputation that Richard Sherman has is even when you lose at the line, the quarterback has decided before they play that he's not even going to come at you. So I think that's what happened there. And the route concept made it so he was not the number one possibility right there. That guy is just running off the clear. But again, he's committed on that particular play to have outside leverage. So you see that jab step, that's why he loses, because he's so committed to outside leverage that jab step forces him to fully commit and spin his hips. Is that it? Is that all of them?
Yep, that's it for now. So let's bring it back to the panel and just talk about how we might be able to quantify some of these kinds of things that Dominique was talking about. He's talking about holding guys at the line, pushing them to the sideline, and so on. So, like, how can we quantify some of these things? Maybe what kinds of models would need to be used? How would we come up with a metric that we could communicate to fans as far as player performance in these areas? Discuss amongst yourselves.
So first thing I would look for is, okay, which one of these plays are press coverage and which ones aren't? And that's a fairly easy thing to do with the player tracking. So we know the events. First of all, we should say that Next Gen Stats and Zebra, the league who are providers of these the tracking data, do an incredible job. The technology involved is amazing. The data is super clean, and if the events are tagged. So if you're a data science person, you know what that means. Like we know when the snap happened. We don't have to figure that out for ourselves. We know when the pass is released. We don't have to figure that out for ourselves. So just get that out of the way. They deserve a lot of credit. So we know when the snap happens, and we can just look at the proximity of the cornerbacks to the wide outs, and given some sort of arbitrary cutoff, say if he's this close to the line of scrimmage, that's going to be press coverage or not. I mean, that would be the very first thing we do. And then after that, we would, I'd talk to Dominique, say what defines a win, what defines a loss.
So before we even get to that, my first concern would be whether it's press or bail. And so bail technique is like a cover 3 normally, and sometimes man coverage. You get up there and press, and at the snap of the ball, you're not interested in getting your hands on. You just turn your hips, open your hips to the quarterback, and you get depth. So that would be something that I would certainly tell you is like, just because they're at the line at the snap of the ball doesn't mean that it's press coverage.
So like proximity, 0.2 seconds after the snap, 0.5 seconds. So that's
like how square their shoulders are at that point and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And then it will be how long you keep them at the line of scrimmage and one of the things that they coach us they used to coach me when you're at the line of scrimmage is to try to keep your body square, because as we saw in that last clip when Richard got beat, he opened his hips to the outside. And once you open your hips one way or the other, if the receiver goes the other way, then you're done.
Yeah, that's one thing. There are limitations to the tracking data too. So, we don't have hip position, unfortunately.
Well, you do have orientation.
We have the shoulders.
That's the same sort of thing, right?
So there are trade-offs. So we can, ultimately, an expert watching film is going to be able to do this in a richer way than we can. But we can do this at a scale and scope that it would take a human, and it's going to be purely objective too. Like one set of rules is going to apply to every single player, not just no favorites or biases.
Yeah, going back to the kind of overall question, when you're asked for such a big question, like how do we evaluate a player in pass defense? It's a really high-level question. One way that I like to at least start to attack something like that is to break it down into a series of smaller questions that we can actually try to answer. So once we've defined, okay, this is what press is and this is what press is after the snap, let's think of a few different small metrics that we can compute relatively quickly that we can then build on as we get into some more intense kind of models. So something like exactly what you're saying, how much is a player disrupting a guy's route, how many yards is he off of where we expected him to go, or how long is it taking this receiver to get 3 yards downfield, would be a couple of things that immediately jump to mind for evaluating how good a guy is in press.
Right, it's almost like you're developing a press coverage win rate rather than looking at the entire scope of it. If you're just focusing on that press coverage, and then we would develop whatever time makes sense between Brian and Dominique figuring that out, how long the defender is within X yards of the receiver.
Right, and it wouldn't be just distance, we would do velocities as well. So you could be, cornerback could be very close in proximity to the receiver, but losing ground. He could be being beat. So what was the saying? If you're even, you're leaving. Right?
That is a saying for slow cornerbacks. I'm not one of those, so I've never heard that in my life.
Yeah. So you could be right next, just right up against, zero distance away, but then still kind of lose that play, I guess.
I get excited whenever we start talking about these things, and I don't want to take us too deep into this rabbit hole, but I do think that it's important to understand the coverage in this also, because that matters with your leverage. And oftentimes the corner will align where his leverage is. So you think about 2-man, which is 2 deep safeties with man coverage underneath. And at that point, you need to win inside. No matter how long you keep him at the line of scrimmage, if you lose the guy inside, that is bad coverage in that particular situation. But understanding all that stuff and how it works I think it makes it more helpful for a particular team because they know their rules. But by and large, all the rules are kind of the same. Coverages are pretty universal. There's some unique tweaks from game plan to game plan, but you can understand. And I think it's another way to use it in reroutes. So in cover 2 or in any sort of zone coverage, it's important to get reroutes because that buys your safeties time if they're going to run 4 verticals on them. If you have a guy who's really laterally quick but not fast, a great thing to test there is how long he can keep the guy on the line of scrimmage. That buys your safeties time, and allows your rush to get home. And all that stuff is interconnected.
Dominique, I'm sure this never applied to you, but
of course,
there may be times where a corner is supposed to be playing press, but may actually back off of that if he's actually not feeling maybe so hot that day or is worried about getting burned by this guy. Brian, I guess, do you think that, or how would we, as kind of the data people, try to build that into a metric talking about press?
That's a tough question. What we would ultimately to be able to do that, I think we'd have to be on the inside. We'd need to be inside the building, as we say. And as kind of neutral outside observers, even at ESPN, we don't know what the play was supposed to be. We have clues, I've learned from Dominique, hey, you can rule out a whole bunch of different pass route possibilities because of the other concepts that are what the other routes, the other receivers are reading, or the number of, is it a 3-step or 7-step drop? We can rule certain things out. So we can have an idea, we can have a clue, but you don't ever know exactly what he was supposed to do. And so we'll get to mind reading, I guess, down the road. We'll have some sensors and helmets eventually, I'm sure.
Yeah, and one of the things we wanted to talk about and to touch on was coverage responsibility, which is our next topic. And we're going to have a Twitter poll in a few moments, so get your phones and laptops ready. But one thing that we had talked about is if you're going to measure the ability of a defensive back in terms of how he's helping his team, you need to know who is responsible for doing what if you're going to appropriately assign credit and blame for different plays that happen. And so that's the sort of the idea of when we want to kind of talk about coverage responsibility. And we have a clip here, and we're going to have a little audience poll. And you guys are going to take a look at this clip and see who you think deserves the response. Who is responsible for the open man here at the bottom of the screen? So it's that on the left there, not the bottom of the screen. My apologies.
Corner. Don't we have it live too? Or we don't?
We do. We can show that in a second here. But this has the numbers on it, and I think you're going to have to vote with the numbers.
Got it.
So we'll leave that up there. But just while everyone's voting, how important is this idea of determining who's responsible for coverage? How difficult is it to determine? I mean, I know there have been some strides in basketball. It's the same kind of idea when you're talking about defense in basketball. If you're going to assign credit and blame to players, you got to know who's responsible for doing what. So how could we start to make some progress in football?
I mean, it's incredibly important because it decides reputations of players. It decides how much guys are getting paid. It decides the schemes that defenses can rely on going forward. So I think there are a few things more important than being able to do that. And I think it turned out to be, at least when we're going through it, it seemed to be easier than I had thought. There's some things that change from scheme to scheme, but by and large, there are a few basic coverages that don't necessarily change, and you understand. One of the interesting thing, or the things that makes it easier, is you know what someone's supposed to do and you know who's wrong because everyone else is doing something right, and you recognize where the holes are, and you recognize, so in certain coverages, cover 2 I mentioned earlier, you see a receiver run past the cornerback's responsibility is the flat, receiver runs past him, he's no longer his responsibility. If the safety is late getting over and they catch the touchdown or they catch a deep pass, then it's not necessarily the corner's fault. The same thing is true if they're underneath zone, because the reason why you can play a deep zone is because the underneath zone is forcing the quarterback to put air on the ball, which then gives you time to break up and break up the ball. So there's some times where the guy who makes the tackle is the guy that gets blamed, but it's not necessarily that person's responsibility. And I think Brian's become smart enough to be able to decipher those things now.
Hopefully, but yeah, and that seems like a pretty standard play pass concept too. So,
yeah.
Number 2 receiver, right? We number from, these are all the great things I've been learning. So you number from outside in, 1, 2, 3 receiver. Number 2 receiver is kind of the slot receiver in this situation. He runs this kind of deep out corner thing, and the number 1 receiver carries that cornerback
like a
deep
post
on a
kinda.
go, and or just deep. And I suppose the cornerback's supposed to hand him off to the safety, the seam off to the safety, and then go.
I don't know. We'll see when we get to the Twitter poll.
I guess.
Well, we have the results of the Twitter poll, speaking of that. So 30% of people said it was number 54. Maybe we can put that dot animation up there again. And I can't read the numbers from here.
Yeah, 54 is the linebacker right there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And 46% of people said number 20.
Yeah.
20 is the corner.
I vote for 20.
And 24% said number 27.
The safety.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
So most people voted for number 20. And you're saying you agree with that?
Got a smart crowd, I think. I mean, it looks like cover 3. And I would love for that linebacker to get more depth to put some air on it, but it seems like the corner is playing man coverage. Like, I wouldn't press in this situation with the splits being as close as they are, and he's pressing and runs all the way across like he thinks it's man coverage. If he's going to get up there, especially with you're responsible for the number 2 receiver also on a vertical in cover 3, if I was up that close, I would bail or I would get off so that you could see that. And I would say that it is, in this one instance, it's the corner's fault.
Do you guys agree
So how would
with
we be
Dominique?
able to, analytically speaking, how would we be able to determine that, Brian? If Dominique's saying if this is kind of a one-off type thing, where in this one instance it would be the corner's fault, but it's not necessarily on a universal plane.
Well, I don't know if we can answer that completely right now, but we know some of the steps we'd have to do along the way. Like, so some of the things we've already done, like so the coverage identification, we've got that pretty well in hand. Pretty sure this play would come up as a cover 3.
Right.
And then, so we would also need to define the roles for each defender within the cover 3. So who's the hook defender, who's the flat defender, who the deep 3 are supposed to be. And we can do that. We can do that pretty well. And then you would also need to sort of identify the routes, which we just sort of completed. And that the combination of that information, I think, would kind of tell you, okay, who should have responsibility for each route.
It's really cool that kind of the algorithm can tell that our corner here probably did the wrong thing. And kind of when you're thinking, this should look like cover 3, like the corner should be taking like that back third. And he's not. And so it's interesting to think about like what the kind of like what that delta looks like in the output of the model from where he should be versus where he actually is, and being able to parse out like, yeah, we think that this corner is wrong partly because the error of where he is versus where he should be is so high.
Like, I don't think he should be pressing.
Yeah, that was the first thing that jumped out at me.
He can't see the number 2 receiver going vertical. And so if he had seen the number 2 receiver kind of carrying vertical past 5 yards, this is all I learned from Dominique. Then he's got joint responsibility for both those verticals.
Right.
Do you guys think that the kind of who the player is matters here? I believe this is Ted Ginn.
Yeah, that's came to my mind. Ted Ginn. I've been a part of teams where there's a receiver, say Randy Moss, that they're like, all right, no matter what the coverage is, you are with him. If he goes into a zone, you stay with him. It doesn't matter. You'll get help. And I don't think that Ted Ginn is that disrespect to Ted Ginn. I would think that he's not that caliber of receiver that would require that in that situation. But I do think that that's where it comes into play. But knowing that there are 3 backers and 4 defensive backs, and they're all playing cover 3 a certain way, the coverages would adjust some if there was some sort of unique coverage, and that's what I would look for. I would ask Brian to help look for is like, if everyone is exactly where they're supposed to be in cover 3, except for this one person, then chances are that he's not doing what he's supposed to be doing. Yeah. But on a team level, you don't have that problem because you know what everyone's responsibility is.
The play design, the other thing that's remarkable is it seems to me that the whole play concept is just a big gamble on exactly this happening. Right. Like this was the idea. This is like the perfect storm for, this coverage, that mistake by that cornerback, and, big chunk gain.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is a cover 3. That's a pass concept that's meant to attack the cover 3. The reason why I said the linebacker, I would love to see him get more depth, is they're missing a flat, someone running into the flat to pull the linebacker down, and it doesn't seem like they have that immediately. So most underneath zone drops are coached to get depth until the ball brings you down. So even if the corner stayed in his spot, he may not have been able to make this play, but he definitely is going to get a 0 on his grade report for this particular play.
All right, so let's move along to our third topic that we wanted to talk about. And actually, you guys have sort of touched on it a little bit, just the idea of the defenders having to make judgment calls in certain situations. And so our third topic was actually anticipation. And so we have a couple clips on that coming up here. Let's see. And so, Dominique, if you could just sort of talk through what you see here.
First of all, this is Tyrann Mathieu. There he is working over. He knows what the play is before the play happens. And that's part of being a cornerback or a defensive back. In this situation, by that formation, he knows what the play is. He's anticipating the play, and he is baiting Phillip Rivers in this point. You see, he shows Phillip Rivers that he's taken away that first kind of over concept, but he knows he's going to that next concept. And it's all about film preparation. You have to know this before the play happens. There are some guys who are actually, there aren't very many guys. I think Champ Bailey is one of the only guys I've ever played with who, like, it didn't matter. He could go out there and not do any film study and just, because he was a better athlete, shut down the receiver. But most guys, you have to kind of know what's coming because the receivers are as good at athletes as we are. So if we don't know what's coming and they know what's coming and the quarterback knows what's coming, you can't win. So that's just a way, again, of Tyrann Mathieu's safety showing there to force that throw and take it away, something that I play with Ed Reed. He did. Like, he's all the way to the Hall of Fame doing that same thing. Do we got another one?
One more.
Yeah, this is another one from him that I love because of the split of those receivers. So this is man coverage, and you see him cut his man loose. Because the receivers are close in the down and distance, he's anticipating this crossing route right here. And again, this is man coverage. The quarterback thinks that Tyrann Mathieu is going to have to run with that guy, and he just disregards that because he knows what's coming. He's able to anticipate because of their formation and because of his film study and get a big turnover right there, and everyone's going to be mad at Derek Carr because he threw that interception. But to be fair, I mean, Tom Brady, Peyton Manning, Aaron Rodgers, they all would have thrown this same interception because every single indication right there. And again, that's what made Ed Reed so great. One of the times I was playing with him, we're in cover 2, which means he has deep halves, and he stole a slant. And it's in part because he knew that the quarterback knew we were in cover 2. So he knew that the quarterback wasn't going to go deep. And he saw 2-by-2, quarterback under center. That means you're going to get quick routes. And he jumps the slant. And we all celebrated. I was angry because I was like, what if he went straight? But he didn't because Ed is smarter than me and all of us together.
So how do we even start going about trying to possibly measure anticipation or judgment calls or a player's decision-making abilities?
I think, so what comes to mind for me is, like, one of the things that we have that you've already started to do is being able to group passing concepts, group passing concepts, not necessarily based on a formation, but based on where the receivers end up. Right? And so you can run, sorry, go ahead.
No, right.
So you can go, the way that I would start to think about building something for anticipation is find all of the plays that look similar and then have the similar coverages. And then you find where the particular player is who made that play. And like the average player, when you're in cover 1 and you get a trips kind of double over concept, the average safety or strong safety, I think is what Mathieu was playing in that situation. The average strong safety is in this position at this time. He is here at this time, and then he is here at that time. And to be able to kind of figure out if there are discrepancies in that for particular players, that would be like my very amateur way of trying to think of how to figure out anticipation. And then when they completely throw out the rules, like that cover 1 concept where you're like, oh, man to man to man, this is all man, but then he throws away the rules but makes a play, is like anticipation to me.
It's almost like if you're setting an expectation for where a standard DB safety would be in that situation, and then how that changes based on the plays like we showed with Mathieu.
Right, you just, over average, below average is the metric somehow. How do you establish that average expectation is the question. And we can detect similar plays, like similar defenses, similar pass concepts, but sometimes they're all kind of unique, so it's hard to, I think it would be a difficult thing, not impossible, but very difficult to kind of establish that sort of baseline. I mean, again, though, going back to, okay, we can identify the coverage, we can identify the role. It looked to me in that first clip like they rotated to single high, and then he had like a robber kind of thing, which you have a lot of freedom in, and you can freelance like that. The second one was completely off the playbook, outside the playbook. But so we could say, like, you should be here in this situation, but you're over here. And so is that over here a good thing or a bad thing, and that could be the
It is funny just thinking about that, combining that with the play where the corner was wrong. It's almost like those things would, if we were able to put together some way to find anticipation, those things might come up as similar, but the difference is, on one play, the play is successful, and other play, the play has failed, because it's the same concept as you're not where you're supposed to be in this route concept with this coverage. But if you're not where you're supposed to be and you happen to make a play, we'd be. So this is how me and Brian work. I come up with crazy ideas. He has a look of consternation and stress on his face.
This is going to be hard.
And then he figures it out in like a week.
I think anticipation can involve plays where the player is where he's supposed to be. But I guess I think of anticipation as almost kind of the precursor to reaction time. Mm-hmm. So sorry, I'm going to talk about safeties, but like how early does a safety start to break on a route to like the outside hash? Like how as the ball is leaving the quarterback's hand, is it just when the quarterback turns and is looking at that guy? And so trying to mark kind of like how far into the play does the defender start to move to where the ball is going to go?
I think in safeties, I don't hate safeties. I love them. They're good. They're part of the family. I played safety a little bit. But I think to go back to corners, Richard Sherman is the guy who does that really well. One of the clips that you guys sent that we didn't use necessarily was against the Browns, and he rerouted his guy, and the guy starts running a vertical route, and Richard Sherman undercuts it and looks back and starts to prepare to catch the ball before the quarterback throws it. And like it's something about, in that situation, it was a single receiver side, trips away, quarterback under. He's in press, and he's like head up in press. He's not leveraged to either side, so it gives the receiver a two-way go, which is something most coaches would tell you not to do. But I think Richard's doing that because it eliminates routes. If you let the receiver choose which way to go, if he's going to run a deep route or outside breaking route, he's going to take the outside. If he's going to run a shorter route, especially in single receiver side or inside breaking route, he's not going to go inside to then go back outside. So he did that, and I think Richard at that point was like, all right, I know this team likes to run skinny posts on the backside of 3-by-1 if you're in press. If they go outside, it's going to be fade. So he breaks underneath. They end up, I think it was Mayfield ends up just overthrowing the ball rather than throwing it right to Richard Sherman. But you saw him snap the ball. He looked to the left to like occupy the safety. Then he turned back to throw, and Richard Sherman standing where he's supposed to be before the receiver breaks and before he throws the ball. And that's just all about anticipation. And then he just throws it away, which is frustrating as a corner because you don't get any love for that. No one, they just say, Baker Mayfield, he's so inaccurate, when actually you're like,
ooh, don't get me started.
Yeah. When in actuality, Baker did the best possible thing in that situation. Well, not if you're the cornerback.
100%.
The best possible
completion
thing.
percentage to the sideline. So that's really interesting, like pass denial. Right, like in basketball, the best defense is like, hey, just lock on and just don't let them get the ball. Don't let their best player ever get the ball. And if you're not going to get any interceptions, you're not going to make any tackles or whatever. And it's very, very hard to detect statistically, right? Like you started off the introduction talking about how box score statistics ignore great play by defenders, because if you never run at me or you never throw at me, you're not even sure if I played in the game.
Right. The stat you talked about on the earlier panel you did about creating sacks for defensive linemen. It's a similar thing for this, is where the D lineman who gets the sack is not always the one who's created the pressure. Sometimes an interior lineman has flushed someone out, and he doesn't get any. He doesn't necessarily get credit for that because the defensive end is out there to get the sack. But
right, like you put air, you make the quarterback put air under the ball, and that lets the safety get the.
And I mean, I don't want to make it a Richard Sherman seminar, but on the other side of that, when anticipation goes bad and keeping it real goes wrong, potentially, Richard Sherman I think it was Sammy Watkins in the Super Bowl caught that. It was Mecole Hardman who caught that deep one on Richard Sherman in the Super Bowl, and I watched that play over and over, and he did the exact same thing that he did in the Browns play, and he did a couple weeks earlier to get an interception where he's head up, he lets Mecole choose which side to go to, he goes inside, and Richard switches hips because he assumes it's an inside breaking route, but he ran an inside release fade, and it wasn't because he was faster, even though he is faster, but that wasn't the reason. It's because they anticipated that Sherman would do that, and they beat him there. So that's the life of a corner sometimes.
All right, so let's move on to a couple questions from the audience. So here's a good one. How are players like Lamar Jackson changing these higher level football strategies? And maybe I'll just add, how would they change kind of how you've talked through trying to measure some of these things about defending the pass?
Well, one of the first things we saw when we had the pass coverage classifications is that Baltimore gets cover 3, single high, safety, or man 1 almost all the time, or much higher than any other team. And that's because you need the extra tackler in the box to contain not just Lamar, but the entire run game. And that entire run game is also a function of kind of the threat of Lamar as well. So right off the bat, we could detect, like, okay, he's forcing defenses to become very predictable for him as a passer. So his running ability really does, even if he doesn't run, makes the passing game easier for him. And so you can see a very, very tangible, run sets up the pass kind of thing. It's true, and we can see that. But that's just one way we can detect it. And you have to have, you don't want to play man-to-man against him either, because you have your back turn, and he's going to scramble for 90 yards if all the DBs have their backs turned, and there might only be 1 or 2 tacklers who are going to be able to get an angle on him.
That was the coolest part for me with Lamar Jackson using the pass coverage stats this year, is that when he scrambled, we were able to tell how much more successful he was when he scrambled against man. It was at one point in the season, he was averaging like 13 yards per scramble when defenses played man, and he took off and ran, which is great that we can be able to tell that, because he's dropping back to pass, and we have all the coverage metrics there.
Even if he doesn't break the line of scrimmage, he's changing like the point from which he's throwing if he breaks the pocket, and that throws the geometry of a lot of defenses off. And so when we're talking about how to evaluate a DB, it might be worth thinking about, like, do we want to evaluate how this player plays when we're within the structure of the play as it's been called, and then if that structure breaks down because the quarterback broke the pocket and now it's a scramble drill, like how well does this guy play in those situations?
All right. Another question. So there's been a ton of progress using data and analytics in sports and other industries also. Do you think other industries have been faster or slower to learn or adapt versus sports? And we could even maybe compare across sports to football versus other sports.
Yeah. Well, within sports, I mean, there's sort of a hierarchy of sports in terms of how easy they are to analyze. And you might start with baseball as the easiest, and then you get your probably your soccers, basketballs, hockeys, and then football. Football is chaos. They call it the ultimate team sport for a reason. I think I'm repeating myself from this morning, but there's all these interactions. What the safety does is actually affects what the fullback might be doing on a play, and there could be 30 yards apart. And so, the player tracking is what's helping us start to kind of isolate the contributions of a single player. I mean, as far as businesses go, the important thing is having some sort. They've always had dollars to sort of measure their output and their productivity, and but they face the exact same problems that we do as football analysts. It's like, how do you isolate the contribution of a single employee or producer? In certain situations like salesmen, you can isolate, their sales, right? So you can directly reward them. But collaborative teams, it's a very, very difficult problem, and football faces the same problem.
I think I agree with kind of when you're thinking about like within a firm and trying to measure the productivity of an employee, but a lot of companies have been doing really effective customer segmentation for a really long time, where like everyone gets these micro-targeted ads now, and that has a lot to do with companies being very data-driven in how they're trying to get their message to very, very specific people. So instead of coming and asking to have an ad that someone like Brian Burke might like, it's like, no, I want Brian Burke to see this ad, not the 100 other people that have a lot in common.
Well, there's a couple of us.
One or two.
There's another Brian Burke out there.
All right. So Dominique, would any of this data have helped you during your playing days?
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is, like I mentioned earlier, it's the same. The things that we're able to find now is the same stuff I was looking for. I just was looking for it by charting stuff in a notebook with my pen, and I have to watch a play 6 times to be able to understand what everyone is doing. Now I can understand what everyone is doing across thousands of plays in a matter of seconds. So absolutely, it would have made things so much easier if that was available. And I'm getting sad. That would have been nice. So much more money.
All right, well, we're about out of time, so that's a wrap. Thank you all for coming and joining us for this discussion, and
thank you.